Hay told us it was already over. That's the thing I keep coming back to even now, 12 years later, when I sit in my office on Murath and watch the stars through my window and think about that week on Karath Station. They told us it was over. The Vrethian coalition had already won. The math was settled. The casualty projections had been filed. Somebody, somewhere in the conclave war rooms, had already started drafting the surrender terms. I was there. I was embedded with the 7th Orbital Defense Detachment. I had a recorder strapped to my chest and a press credential stitched to my environmental suit, and I was taking notes in the margins of a tactical map that the station commander, a Drenathi named Usrulvok, had handed me personally on the first morning. He handed it to me and he said, in that flat, exhausted way the Drenathi speak when they've stopped hoping, he said, "Take this. You'll want to document the final positions, for the record." He meant for the record of defeat. He meant he was going to lose, and he knew it, and he wanted someone to write it down properly. I want to tell you what happened instead. The station at the edge of everything. Karath Station sat in those days before they rebuilt it, at the junction of 3 shipping lanes in the outer reaches of what the conclave calls the Pale Margin. It's not a glamorous posting. It's not a place anyone chose. The station was built 70 years before the Vrethian expansion to regulate trade traffic between the conclave's industrial worlds and 3 smaller, independent systems that had signed economic cooperation agreements, but never full membership. By the time the war came to them, Karath Station was old. The docking clamps were rusted in 3 places. The atmospheric processors wheezed through the night cycle in a way that made new arrivals think something was broken. The gravity plating on Deck 7 had been running at 0.91, standard for 11 years, because nobody had prioritized getting the replacement parts out to the Pale Margin. It was the kind of place the war was supposed to pass over. It didn't. The Vrethian coalition wanted the shipping lanes. Not the station itself. The station was a relic worth nothing to them as infrastructure. But whoever controlled Karath Station controlled the choke point. 3 shipping lanes converging into 1 approach corridor. Block the station and you could starve the industrial worlds. Starve the industrial worlds and the conclave's manufacturing capacity drops by 30%. Drop manufacturing capacity by 30% mid-war and you don't need to win battles anymore. The enemy just runs out of ships to field. Usrulvok understood this. He'd been commanding the station for 4 years, and he was a good officer, genuinely good. The kind of commander who knows every name on his roster and knows the difference between a soldier who's scared and a soldier who's done. He had 2,300 Drenathi troops, a company of Releth auxiliary fighters, a squadron of aging interceptor craft, and a defense grid that hadn't been upgraded since the station was commissioned. Against him, the Vrethian coalition had deployed the 8th Hammer Division. I need to take a moment here and explain what the 8th Hammer was, because if you've only read the official histories, you've read a sanitized version. The 8th Hammer was the coalition's primary siege unit. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't negotiate. They specialized in what the coalition's own doctrine called saturation reduction, a term that meant, when you stripped the bureaucracy away from it, that they bombed a position until nothing was left standing, and then they sent ground troops through the rubble to confirm the silence. They had done this to 14 conclave installations before Karath, 14 positions. None of them had held. The 8th Hammer had 4,700 soldiers, a fleet of 12 warships in orbit, and a commander named Veth Crossel who had never lost an engagement in his career. His troops called him the Grinder, not as an insult, as a tribute. So when I say the math was settled, I mean it in the most literal sense. 14 for 14, a defender-to-attacker ratio of 2-to-1 against us. Aging equipment against modern siege hardware. An isolated outpost with no possibility of reinforcement, because every conclave rapid response fleet was committed elsewhere. Usrulvok knew all of this. He knew it the way you know something that sits in your chest like a cold stone. He wasn't broken by it. He was the farthest thing from broken, but he was clear-eyed. He made his preparations. He positioned his troops. He ran his drills. He requisitioned additional ammunition from the station's reserve stores and redistributed it to the forward positions. And then he sent one more communication to Conclave Command. He sent it on the 3rd day before the 8th Hammer arrived. He was requesting reinforcement. He knew no rapid response fleet could reach him. He wasn't asking for a fleet. He was asking for anything. A company, a platoon, even a squad. Something to put in the gap on Corridor 7, which was his most vulnerable point, a long approach tunnel that led directly from the secondary docking bays into the station's core infrastructure. It was 80 meters wide. His existing forces couldn't cover it without pulling troops from the outer defense line. He sent the request. He didn't expect a response. He told me later in the quiet hours of the second night that he'd sent it more as a formality than a hope. Because commanders are supposed to exhaust every option before they accept the outcome, and sending a request he knew wouldn't be answered was still, technically, exhausting an option. The response came 14 hours later. I was in the command center when it arrived. Usrulvok read it twice, which wasn't like him. He was a fast reader, a quick processor. He read it twice, and then he looked up at the communications officer and he said, "Read it back to me," out loud. The communications officer read it back. Usrulvok was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Contact Docking Bay 14. Tell them to prepare a receiving berth. Our reinforcement is inbound." He said reinforcement, singular. The communication had indicated that one unit was being dispatched from the Conclave's newly activated human military exchange program. One unit. A small one. The communication had listed 38 individuals. 38 soldiers traveling in a single converted transport, arriving in 11 hours. 38 soldiers to close a gap that could swallow a battalion. Usrulvok was quiet for the rest of that day, and I couldn't tell whether the look on his face was relief or something more complicated. I know now that it was the second thing. He'd read the briefing files on the human military exchange program. He knew who he was getting. He just didn't know yet what that meant in practice. None of us did. First contact with something different. They arrived without ceremony. The transport that docked at Bay 14 was a Conclave standard vessel. Nothing special. The kind of courier converted to personnel use that you'd see in 100 stations across the pale margin. It locked into the docking clamps at 3:40 station time, the deep middle of the night cycle, when the corridors are dim and the atmospheric processors are doing their loud, breathing thing, and there's nobody around who doesn't have to be there. I was there because I was always there. I was there because a war correspondent worth anything doesn't sleep when there's a story moving. I had my recorder running. I want to be honest about that. I had it running partly out of professional habit and partly because I was curious in a way I couldn't entirely explain. I'd heard about humans. Everyone in the Conclave press corps had heard about humans. They'd been a subject of diplomatic discussion for 6 years. This species from a blue-green world at the edge of explored space, who'd come to the Conclave's attention not through some dramatic first contact, but through a series of increasingly bewildering requests for trade agreements. They were, in the diplomatic files, noted primarily for being unexpectedly persistent. What that meant in a military context, I was about to find out. The docking bay doors opened. They came out single file, 38 of them in a column, and the first thing I noticed was the sound. They were wearing armor, standard Conclave-issue environmental and impact armor, but modified in ways I didn't recognize, fitted differently. The way it moved with them was different. And then there was the sound of their boots on the deck plating. Not a shuffle, not a march in the performative, cadence sense. Something in between, purposeful, rhythmic, not trying to make noise, but not trying to eliminate it either. The sound of people who are used to moving through hard environments and have stopped thinking about it. The second thing I noticed was their faces. I've covered wars for 22 years. I've seen soldiers on every species' homeworld and outpost and battlefield. I know what soldiers look like before an engagement they've been told they'll probably lose. I know the specific quality of that stillness, that particular way eyes move when someone is managing information they don't want to feel yet. These people didn't look like that. They looked, this is going to sound strange, and I've spent 12 years trying to find a better word for it. They looked settled. Not calm in an artificial way, not the flat affect of someone who's suppressed their responses. Settled. Like the situation as presented had been processed and filed and they'd moved on to the practical questions. The one at the front of the column, their commanding officer, as I would learn in the next few minutes, stopped at the edge of the docking bay and looked around the space with the quick, methodical scan of someone taking tactical inventory. He was not large in the way that some species soldiers are large. He was medium height by most standards. Dark complexion, short-cropped hair, and eyes that moved in a way that made me feel like the entire bay had been photographed and analyzed before he'd completed the turn of his head. His name was Sergeant Major Declan Morrow. I remember thinking in that first moment that the name didn't sound like a military name. I'd expected something that translated to a title or an achievement. Many species name their soldiers that way, the way the Drenathi give their officers names that mean things like shield holder or twice proven. Declan Morrow sounded like a person, like someone's neighbor. He introduced himself to Usrul Vox receiving officer, a young lieutenant named Thessaloon who was clearly trying very hard not to look as surprised as he felt. Morrow spoke through a translation unit clipped to his collar, and his voice was level and direct without being aggressive. He said, "We understand the gap is in Corridor 7. We'd like to see it before we rest, if that's possible." It was 3:40. They had been traveling for 11 hours in a courier transport with uncertain life support. They'd just been told they were defending a station against the Conclave's most lethal siege division. "We'd like to see it before we rest." Thessaloon didn't know what to do with that. He looked at me. I was standing to his left, and I must have looked equally lost. And then he composed himself and said he'd take them to Corridor 7 immediately. They followed him through the station. All 38 of them, single file, in those modified boots making that particular sound on the deck plating. I followed at the back of the column, recorder running, trying to catalog what I was observing. They talked quietly to each other as they moved. Not chat or information, short exchanges. I caught fragments through my translator. What's the ceiling height in the main junction, and any idea what their breach pattern looked like at Margith Station? And Corporal, remind me who we have with the AP loadout. Questions and answers passing down the line like a current. The entire column thinking and communicating and preparing simultaneously, while also walking through an unfamiliar station in the middle of the night cycle. We reached Corridor 7. Morrow stood at the entrance and looked down its length for a long time. 80 meters wide, high vaulted ceiling, an industrial approach corridor designed to move cargo and machinery, not defend against a military assault. Usrul Vox engineering teams had set up basic barricade positions, but they were sparse and the sightlines were terrible. It was, as Usrul Vox had noted in his request, a gap. Morrow was quiet for almost a full minute. The soldiers behind him were quiet too, doing their own assessments. Then Morrow turned to the closest of his unit, a tall woman with close-cropped red hair and a quiet, precise way of moving, and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Well, it's not ideal." And she said, "No." And he said, "We'll make it work." And she said, "Yes, we will." Not with bravado, not with the kind of performative confidence that soldiers sometimes project to manage their own fear. With the matter-of-fact tone of two people looking at a difficult repair job and agreeing they have the skills to complete it. I had been covering wars for 22 years. I had interviewed generals and commanders and decorated heroes on 5 worlds. I had heard 1,000 variations of the speech that soldiers give themselves and each other before impossible engagements. I had never heard anything that sounded like that. The 3 days before, the 8th hammer arrived on schedule. That was part of Veth Crossel's reputation, punctuality in the business of destruction. He gave stations a window of approach notification because he'd found, statistically, that it produced more chaos than surprise. People who know the 8th hammer is coming have 3 days to imagine it arriving. 3 days of that imagination is worth 2 companies of shock troops in the opening hour of an assault. The 3 days before were not, for the humans, a period of fear. I need to be careful here because I don't want to romanticize it or flatten it. I'm not saying the humans were fearless. Fear is a biological function. It exists in every sentient species that's faced predators or warfare, and the humans were not exempt from it. What I'm saying is that fear, for them, appeared to function differently. I watched them work. For 3 days I watched them work, and I took notes. And what I observed was a kind of relationship with extreme stress that I had simply never encountered before. The first thing they did, the very first thing the morning after their arrival, was run physical drills in Corridor 7. Not tactical drills, physical drills. Endurance movement, strength maintenance, coordination exercises. In the corridor they were about to defend against a siege unit that had never failed. They were running drills, and there was occasional laughter, and there were arguments about form and technique. and someone had pulled out a small device that was playing a low, rhythmic music through a speaker while they worked. Us Rolvox troops watched from the adjacent corridors. I watched too. I didn't know what I was seeing exactly, but I knew it was something worth recording. The second thing they did was learn. Morrow requested a full technical briefing on the station's infrastructure. Not just the tactical positions, the infrastructure. He wanted to know about the power conduits, the atmospheric flow systems, the maintenance tunnels, the emergency bulkhead sequences, the cargo lift mechanisms. Things that a soldier defending a corridor has no obvious use for. His second-in-command, Staff Sergeant Naomi Reyes, the tall woman with the red hair, sat in the briefing with a physical notebook and wrote things down in a compact, rapid script. When the Drenathi engineers presenting the briefing paused to check if she had questions, she had questions. Good ones, specific ones. The kind of questions that told you she'd been processing the information in real time and following threads to their logical conclusions. The third thing they did was introduce themselves to the Drenathi troops. This sounds simple. It was not simple. Drenathi and humans have significant physiological differences, and early in the war there had been documented cases of unintentional offense in cross-species unit interactions, gestures that meant respect in one culture functioning as challenge or insult in another. The humans navigated this not by becoming less human, but by being transparent about the differences. Morrow gathered a mixed group of his soldiers and Us Rolvox troops in the Deck 3 common area and simply said, through his translator, "We do things differently where we come from. I'll tell you what our things mean, and you tell me what yours mean, and we won't have any accidents." It was so direct that Us Rolvox soldiers were momentarily startled. Drenathi's social negotiation is typically indirect, layered with implication and subtext. Morrow's approach, just naming the problem and proposing a solution, was so foreign to their expectations that it landed as a kind of radical honesty. By the end of the second day, I had observed something I hadn't expected. Us Rolvox troops, exhausted, frightened people who'd been told they were losing, had begun to change slightly in posture when they were near the human unit. Not imitation exactly, more like proximity to a different frequency of energy had altered something in them. Corporal Usseldan, one of Us Rolvox's youngest soldiers, told me about it later. She said they were afraid too. You could see it sometimes in quiet moments, but it was like their fear was working for them somehow, like it was fuel. I'd never seen that before. On the third day, the 8th hammer entered weapons range. The night before contact, I spent part of that night talking to Morrow. It wasn't planned. I was in the corridor outside the temporary quarters the human unit had taken over, doing nothing in particular. Sometimes war correspondents have to just exist somewhere for a while. And Morrow came out of the room and sat down against the wall across from me. He had a small container of liquid that I later learned was a beverage his species called coffee, and he was looking at the deck plating with the particular quality of attention that means someone is thinking and not seeing what they're looking at. I asked if I could record. He said yes. Then I wasn't sure what to ask. I said, "Can I ask you something personal?" He said, "Sure." I said, "Why are you here? You're not from the Conclave. This isn't your war. The exchange program has been running for less than 2 years. Nobody would have pushed back if you declined this posting." He considered the question. He took a drink of his coffee. He said, "We have this thing back home. It's not exactly a principle. It's more like something that grew out of a very long, very ugly history. The idea is that when you have the capacity to stop something terrible and you choose not to, that choice has a weight. It stays with you. I don't know how to explain it better than that." I said, "That sounds like guilt as a motivator." He said, "Maybe. Or maybe it's the opposite of guilt. It's not wanting to become the version of yourself that let it happen." I sat with that for a while, then I asked another question. I asked, "Are you afraid?" He looked at me then. Direct eye contact, which carries different valence across different species, but with humans tends to indicate they're taking something seriously. He said, "I've been afraid since I read the briefing on the 8th hammer. I'll probably be afraid until this is over, and if I'm honest, probably after it too." I said, "Does that make this harder?" He said, "No, he paused. Back home, we have a long history of thinking that bravery means not being afraid. We were wrong about that. Bravery is being afraid and going forward anyway because the alternative is not something you can live with. I don't know if that translates." It translated. I went back to my quarters that night and I lay in the dim of the station, and I listened to the atmospheric processors doing their wheezing thing, and I thought about what he'd said. I thought about 14 installations. I thought about the grinder and the eighth hammer. I thought about 38 humans and their modified boots and their notebooks and their music and their coffee. And I thought, something is different here. I didn't know yet how different, not specifically, but I could feel it in the way you sometimes feel the change in air pressure before a storm. Something was different. I just didn't know yet what it would cost. The first wave. The eighth hammer opened the assault at 600 station time. They were punctual about this too. It began with orbital bombardment, the coalition's ships in position above Karath, targeting the station's outer defense emplacements with precision strikes. Not carpet bombing, they were too professional for that. Precision, systematic, methodical. They'd done this 14 times. They knew exactly which emplacements to neutralize first, which power systems to degrade, which atmospheric zones to compromise to make the defenders uncomfortable in their suits. In Corridor 7, 38 humans prepared. I was in the command center with Usrul Vok, watching the tactical feeds, but I had my recorder relayed to a unit I'd given to a young corporal in Morrow's unit. A quiet, observant man named Private First Class Tobias Wen, who had agreed to carry it and keep it running. I would see the footage later. In the moment, I was watching data and listening to Usrul Vok's officers reporting positions. The bombardment lasted 40 minutes. Then the outer hull breaches opened. The 8th Hammer's ground troops entered through 6 simultaneous points, which was their standard pattern. 4 points were the expected primary approaches, well defended, meant to absorb Drenathi fire and draw attention. 2 points were secondary, less expected. One of the secondary points was the far end of Corridor 7. Veth Crossell had done his assessment. He'd identified the gap. What he didn't know was that the gap had been filled. The first wave of 8th Hammer troops entered Corridor 7 at approximately 6:43. The footage Tobias captured shows the moment from a position near the human unit's primary barricade, a structure they'd spent 3 days constructing out of cargo containers, station equipment, and a series of repurposed atmospheric conduit panels that Naomi Reyes had identified as having exceptional blast-dampening properties. The 8th Hammer soldiers, massive in heavy siege armor with the Coalition's signature red-black color scheme, came through the far end of the corridor in their standard formation. They'd done this before. They knew how to move through a corridor. They knew how to suppress a position. They'd cleared Margith Station's defense tunnels in under 2 hours. The footage shows them reaching approximately the 40-meter point before the humans opened fire. What happened next is the part I've thought about the most, trying to find the right words. I'll try. They didn't just shoot at the 8th Hammer. They engaged them in a way that was orchestrated isn't quite right. Coordinated isn't quite right either, because coordination implies planning, and this looked like something more fluid than planning. It looked like 38 people who had spent 3 days thinking about this exact corridor in every detail from every angle, and had developed a collective understanding of it that was almost intuitive. The barricade positions were set up to create a crossfire pattern that minimized exposure while maximizing coverage. Reyes had mapped the atmospheric conduit layout and identified 3 junctions where a specific charge could create a pressure burst. Not lethal, but massively disorienting, especially for species whose auditory processing centers were in external membranes, which 8th Hammer soldiers were. Every time the front wave advanced, a conduit junction fired. Not at random, in sequence, timed to the 8th Hammer's own advance rhythm, which Morrow had apparently been able to infer from the briefing on Margith Station's breach reports. He'd read about a previous defeat and extracted the enemy's tempo from it. I want to sit with that for a moment. He'd read about a station the 8th Hammer had destroyed, one of their victories, 14 for 14, and he'd used the record of that defeat to understand how the enemy moved. The first wave retreated at 7:12, 29 minutes. They'd penetrated 11 meters into the corridor, then they'd stopped, and then they'd fallen back. I was in the command center when Usrul Vok's tactical officer updated the board. The officer stared at the screen for a moment. Then she said, in the kind of voice people use when they're trying not to show that something has startled them, Corridor 7 is holding. Usrul Vok looked at the screen. He said nothing for a moment, then he said, "How are our people?" His officer said, "Drenathi forces, 2 wounded, no fatalities." Corridor 7 unit, she paused. 1 wounded, no fatalities. Usrulvok closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked like someone who has just felt an unexpected thing in a place where they had stopped expecting things. He said, send them a resupply team. Between waves. In the 3 hours between the first and second waves, I made it to Corridor 7. The barricade was intact. The humans were checking and redistributing their equipment with the same methodical efficiency I'd observed in the pre-battle drills. Some of them were eating, ration packs, pulled out of their kit with the casual practicality of people who know that nutrition is ammunition and you don't neglect either. The single wounded member of their unit was a corporal named Adiz Okonkwo. She'd taken a fragment hit to her left arm, not life-threatening, but deep and painful. She was sitting against the barricade, and the unit's medical specialist was working on her arm, and she was talking through her teeth about the trajectory of the enemy's second-rank soldiers during the first wave push, providing what was clearly tactical analysis while getting her arm sealed. She looked up when I approached. She said, "Are you the correspondent?" I said yes. She said, "Tell them they held. Make sure the record says they held." She wasn't talking about the humans. She was talking about the Drenathi soldiers at the other barricade positions who'd been under simultaneous assault at 5 other points and had held every one. I made sure the record said they held. I'm saying it now. Moro found me near the barricade and we spoke briefly. He looked tired, not broken, not depleted, but honestly tired in the way people look when they've been running on adrenaline and competence for several hours. He was drinking more of his coffee. I asked how he'd known the conduit pressure timing. He said, Ray's figured it out. She spent 12 hours on the atmospheric schematics. She basically redesigned the corridor's defensive capacity from the inside out using what was already there. I said, was that in your training? He said, improvisation is in our training. Specific solutions aren't. That's kind of the point. I said, what do you expect from the second wave? He said, more of them, different entry angle. They'll have done their own analysis of the first push and figured out what slowed them down. They're good. I want to be clear about that. They're really good. This isn't going to be easier. I said, are you worried? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm worried about Adiz's arm, and I'm worried about the Drenathi troops on the outer line because they've been under pressure all morning and their resupply window is closing. And I'm worried about the power conduits on the east wall because they've been taking indirect hit vibration, and if they go, we lose 3 of our disruption points. He paused. Those are the things I'm worried about. The second wave is just the second wave. We'll deal with it when it gets here. That, I think, is the core of what I was watching during those 3 days, and that long first morning. The humans didn't manage fear by pretending the threat wasn't real, or by convincing themselves they were invincible, or by retreating into ritual and ceremony. They managed it by being so specifically, practically engaged with the actual problems in front of them that the existential weight of the situation had nowhere to land. They were too busy thinking about Adiz's arm and the east wall conduits to be crushed by the fact that the 8th hammer had never lost. The second wave came at 1400. The long afternoon. The second wave was larger. Vethcrossel had, as Moro predicted, adjusted. He sent twice the number of soldiers through the Corridor 7 approach, and they came in a different formation, a wider front, attempting to dilute the crossfire advantage the humans had established. He also sent a team to the maintenance tunnels adjacent to the corridor, attempting to flank the barricade position from below. This is the part of the story where things get brutal, and I want to be honest about that. War correspondents sometimes sand the edges off when they're writing about battles involving their own side's soldiers. I'm going to try not to do that. The second wave was brutal. It lasted 4 hours. The wider formation did partially dilute the crossfire pattern. The flanking attempt through the maintenance tunnels was identified and countered. Moro had assigned 2 soldiers to monitor the tunnel access points, specifically because Reyes had identified them as a potential vulnerability during her infrastructure briefing. But countering it cost them. By the end of the second wave, the human unit had 4 wounded and 1 killed. His name was Private First Class Tobias Wen, the same Tobias who'd been carrying my recorder. He was 23 years old, from a place on Earth called Singapore, and he'd been in the unit for 14 months. He died holding a tunnel access point that would have allowed the flanking force to reach the barricade from behind. He held it alone for 6 minutes while reinforcement arrived. He didn't hold it because he'd been ordered to stay. He'd been told to fall back if the flankers came in force. He stayed because the reinforcement wasn't going to make it in time, and he'd done the math on what happened to the barricade if the tunnel opened. He made the calculation. He held the point. The barricade held. I didn't know until afterward that he'd been carrying my recorder. When his kit was recovered, the recorder was still running. I have the footage. I've watched it once. I don't watch it again. It is filed under my personal archive, sealed, and I've noted in my will that it should go to his family if they want it. I'm telling you his name because the record should have it. Tobias Wen, 23 years old. Singapore, 14 months in the unit. He held the tunnel. Corridor 7 did not fall on the second wave. Part 2. Document Classification. Open Archive, Galactic Historical Record. Filed by Senior War Correspondent Vrethalis, 3rd Press Division, Conclave Broadcasting Network. Continuation of Personal Field Account, The Siege of Karath Station. The night in the middle. After the second wave, Usrulvok called a command assessment. I sat in the back of the room and watched. His officers were exhausted in the way that people become exhausted after sustained high-intensity combat, not sleepy exhausted, but ground-down exhausted, the kind where everything takes slightly more effort than it should, and your processing time is a half-second slower than normal. They reported the positions. Every line had held. The cost across the entire station was 23 Dranathi killed, 61 wounded, 1 interceptor destroyed in the hangar bay from an orbital strike overshoot. And in Corridor 7, 1 human killed, 4 wounded. Usrulvok's officers knew the number. They looked at the Corridor 7 entry on the board, and they looked at it in a particular way that I have thought about many times since. It was the look of people encountering something that doesn't fit their existing model of how things work, and not quite knowing yet what to do with the discrepancy. Usrulvok said, "I want to visit Corridor 7. His operations officer said, "Commander, the second wave ended less than an hour ago. The corridor approaches are still." Usrulvok said, "I know, I want to visit Corridor 7. We went, Usrulvok, his operations officer, 2 aides, and me at the back with my recorder running. The corridor was dim. Some of the lighting panels had been damaged during the second wave, and the emergency strips had taken over, giving everything a flat, amber tone that made the whole space look like something preserved in amber, suspended. The human unit was in various states of activity. Some were checking equipment. Some were eating. Some were sleeping on the deck with their helmets off and their faces slack in the uncomplicated way that people sleep when exhaustion finally overrides everything else. Morrow was awake, talking quietly with Rays near the primary barricade. He looked up when Usrulvok entered. He straightened, not stiffly, but with the attentive quality of someone registering that a commander has arrived and adjusting their posture accordingly. Usrulvok stood in front of him for a moment. In Dranathi culture, direct statements of appreciation between commanders are considered presumptuous. They imply an evaluation of the other's performance, which implies a hierarchy of judgment that senior officers find uncomfortable to project. So there's a whole vocabulary of indirect acknowledgement that Dranathi commanders use instead. Usrulvok didn't use any of it. He said in his flat, exhausted voice, through the translation system, "You held." Morrow said, "We held." Usrulvok said, "Tell me about the tunnel. Tell me what your soldier did." Morrow told him, briefly, without embellishment. The facts of it, the calculation that Tobias had made, the 6 minutes, the outcome. His voice was steady throughout. I could see in the set of his jaw that the steadiness was something he was choosing, consciously, moment to moment. He was in grief. He was also still in command of a unit that had another wave coming in the morning. He was choosing his posture because his unit was watching him, even the ones who looked asleep. When he finished, Usrulvok was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "In our culture we have a tradition. When a soldier dies for a position, the position takes their name. It becomes their station, their memorial." He paused. "This corridor is Wen Station." Morrow was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that has weight and texture. Then he said, he would have thought that was a bit much. Usrulvok said, "Most of the people in our memorials would, that's the point." Something passed between them in that moment. I saw it, but I can't fully describe it. The way two very different people from very different worlds with very different ways of processing loss briefly touched the same understanding. It lasted a second, maybe two. Then Usrulvok nodded and said he'd make it official in the station records. He turned to go, then he stopped. He said, without turning back, "Morrow, the third wave will be their heaviest. Crossell has never committed his reserve units to a position that held through two waves. He will tomorrow. He won't accept the pattern." Morrow said, "I know." Usrulvok said, "I want a second 40 of my troops to corridor to Wen Station, if you'll have them." Morrow said, "I'll have them. Have your lieutenant talk to Reyes tonight about integration positions." Usrulvok nodded again and left. I stayed behind for a while. I watched the corridor in its amber light, the sleeping soldiers and the working ones and the equipment and the sealed section of tunnel where Tobias Wen had made his calculation. I thought about the name, Wen Station. I thought about being 23 years old and doing the math on what it cost to hold something that needed holding. I turned off my recorder, not because there was nothing worth recording, because some moments are better witnessed than documented. I turned it back on after 20 minutes. Integration and the long vigil. The night before the third wave, Reyes and Usrulvok's lieutenant, a young, sharp officer named Thessaloon, the same one who'd received the humans at the docking bay, worked for 4 hours on the integration plan. I sat in on it because by that point nobody was telling me to leave. It was remarkable to watch, not because it was smooth. It wasn't smooth. There were communication difficulties, translation gaps, moments where one side's tactical vocabulary didn't map onto the other's. The Dranathi system of defensive positioning uses a grid notation that doesn't translate to the human's directional system. And for about 30 minutes, they were essentially speaking different languages about the same corridor while trying to figure out how their approaches to defensive architecture could work together. Then Reyes put a piece of paper flat on the table and said, "Can we start from the corridor and work out? Just the corridor, not the notation systems. What does the corridor need?" Thessaloon looked at the paper. He said, "Overlapping coverage at the 40-meter mark. That's where both waves stalled and tried to pivot." Reyes said, "Agreed. So we anchor at 40 meters and build the coverage from there. Your troops in arcs from the east. They have better endurance in the suit configuration you're using. You can hold static positions longer. My people in mobile elements from the west were better at fast repositioning under fire." Thessaloon said, Yes, that works." They spent the next 3 hours building it out. By the end, they had a plan that was neither Dranathi doctrine nor human doctrine. It was something new, built from the actual properties of the corridor and the actual capabilities of the soldiers who were going to defend it. It looked, on the paper Reyes kept annotating, like a living thing. In the early hours of the morning, while the plan was being finalized and the integrated unit was sleeping in shifts, the humans and Dranathi mixed together in the amber light of the corridor, wrapped in their respective equipment, some of them talking quietly in the gaps. I found Reyes sitting alone near the barricade and asked her what she was thinking. She said, "I'm thinking about the east wall conduits. 2 of them took significant vibration stress during the second wave. If they fail during the third wave, we lose the disruption sequence and the 40-meter hold becomes much harder." I said, "Can they be repaired?" She said, "Station engineering is on it, but they're also patching 6 other systems and they've been awake for 18 hours. So, maybe." I said, "What's your backup if the conduits fail?" She smiled. It was a tired smile, a real one. She said, "That's why I haven't slept yet." I let her work. Dawn. The third wave came at 5:30. Usrulvok had been right. Vethkrossel's reserve units were the 8th Hammer's most experienced soldiers, veterans of every one of their 14 campaigns, the nucleus of the division's capability. They came in through Corridor 7 with 6 times the force of the first wave. They also came in through 2 adjacent maintenance corridors simultaneously, having apparently found access points that weren't in the station's official schematics. I was in the command center. The tactical board lit up in a way I hadn't seen in 2 days, a level of simultaneous pressure across multiple approaches that made Usrulvok's operations officer briefly go very still before she started managing the response. In Wen Station, I'm using the name now because that's what it was, the integrated human Dranathi unit faced the heaviest assault of the siege. What happened in the next 6 hours is documented in the records. I'll tell you what the records say and what the records don't say, because there are things that combat footage captures and things it misses. The records show the positions holding. They show the integrated unit adapting the plan in real time as the maintenance corridor attacks opened new angles. They show Morrow moving through the position continuously, not behind the barricade but among it, repositioning, communicating, making decisions at the speed the situation demanded. They show Ray's, when the east wall conduits finally failed at 8:17 as she'd feared, activating the backup she'd spent the night building. A manual pressure system using the station's cargo lift hydraulics, routed through access panels she'd identified in the atmospheric schematics and modified during the previous night's quiet hours. It was improvised, it was ungainly, it worked. The records show the Dranathi troops, Usral Vox people, exhausted, grieving their dead, defending a position they'd been told they couldn't hold, fighting with a quality that their own commander later told me he hadn't seen before. Not better technically than they'd been trained. Better in a different way. More willing to hold when holding felt impossible. More willing to trust the plan, trust the person next to them, trust that the gap between what they were capable of and what the situation demanded could be closed by choosing to close it. Proximity to a different frequency of energy, Corporal Usseldan had said. What the records don't show is the moment at 9:34, when the 8th Hammer's front rank finally broke. I mean that precisely. There is no recorded footage of the specific second when it happened, because every active recorder in the corridor was focused on a contact point. What I know is reconstructed from witness accounts. At 9:34, after 4 hours of sustained assault against a position that had not moved, something changed in the 8th Hammer's advance. The veterans who formed the reserve unit's nucleus, soldiers who had taken 14 stations, who had never failed, who had operated on the assumption that their success was structural, mechanically inevitable. Those soldiers began to do something they had apparently not done before in the documented history of the 8th Hammer. They hesitated. Not one soldier, the wave. Morrow later told me he noticed it in the rhythm of their fire. The suppression pattern became irregular, small gaps, brief pauses that weren't tactical repositioning but something else, something cognitive. He said, I've been in enough fights to know the difference between an enemy that's taking cover and an enemy that's questioning something. These guys were questioning something. What they were questioning was the thing that Vethkrossel's entire career had been built on. The inevitability, the math, 14 for 14, the grinder. The math wasn't working. The record says the 8th Hammer's advance stalled at 9:40 and began a tactical withdrawal at 9:52. The withdrawal became a full retreat by 10:15. At 10:34, Usral Vox received an emergency communication from Vethkrossel's command ship. The grinder was requesting a ceasefire for casualty recovery. The aftermath I witnessed. Usral Vox took the communication in the command center. He read it. He handed it to his operations officer. She read it. She looked at Usral Vox with an expression I don't have the language to fully describe, something between vindication and awe and a kind of bewildered gratitude. He granted the ceasefire, because that's the kind of commander he was. Even in the moment of an impossible victory, he was thinking about the humans on both sides of the line who needed to recover their dead. He granted it, and then he sat down in his command chair, and he didn't say anything for about 3 minutes. His officers were quiet too. The command center was very still. Then his communications officer said, Commander, Corridor 7 the Wen Station unit is reporting all positions intact. Usral Vox said, tell them. She said, tell them what? He said, just tell them, they'll know what it means. She opened the channel and said, Wen Station, Command Center, the third wave has broken, requesting ceasefire is active, corridor holds. There was a pause on the channel. Then Morrow's voice came through, and it was steady and controlled in the way his voice was always steady and controlled. But underneath the control there was something, a frequency, a catch, something human. He said, copy that command, corridor holds. And then in the background of the transmission, not through the command link, but through the ambient pickup on the channel, I heard something. The human unit, and the Dranathi troops who'd been integrated into the position, 40 of Usral Vox soldiers who'd spent 6 hours in a corridor named after a 23-year-old from Singapore. Those soldiers made a sound together that I don't have a word for in my language. Not cheering, not the victory shout of soldiers who have won. Something quieter and more complex. The sound of people who were still here and hadn't expected to be. I turned off my recorder. I turned it back on. I didn't know what to say to it, so I just let it run. What came after? The ceasefire extended. 3 days became a negotiated pause, and the negotiated pause became the opening of formal talks, because what the Eighth Hammer's failure at Kareth Station had done to the Coalition's military calculus, to Veth Crossel's career, to the strategic assumption that the Pale Margin was indefensible, was more significant than the loss of a single siege engagement. 14 for 14 had been the Eighth Hammer's record. Their record was now 14 for 14, and one that got away, and that one mattered in ways that 14 clean victories couldn't match. Because the 15 stations that the Coalition had been planning to take after Kareth now had to be reconsidered. Because the 38 humans who'd arrived at 340 in modified boots had demonstrated something that couldn't be undemonstrated. I'm not going to tell you that the war ended because of Kareth Station. Wars don't end because of single battles, usually. What I'll tell you is that the strategic map shifted, and the shift opened possibilities that hadn't existed before, and 18 months later a treaty was signed. And while I can't draw a clean line from Wen Station to that treaty, I know the people who were in those negotiations, and I know that Kareth Station came up in every significant conversation. I stayed on the station for 2 weeks after the siege. In that time, I watched the human unit, reduced now, some of them evacuated for medical care, Tobias Wen's absence of presence in its own right, interact with the Drenathi troops who'd shared the corridor with them. The integration that had been tactical necessity became something else in the aftermath. I watched Morrow and Usrul Vok develop the kind of relationship that forms between people who have been through something that most people haven't, that language doesn't fully cover. I watched Reyes teach a Drenathi engineering crew 3 different applications of her cargo lift hydraulic pressure system, sketching diagrams in her notebook and gesturing at conduit access panels with the animated focus of someone who loves their work. I watched Corporal Adiz Akonkwo, arm healing, spend an afternoon with Corporal Usuldan in the Deck 3 common area, showing her something on a small personal device. Music, I think, the same rhythmic music I'd heard during the pre-battle drills. Usuldan was listening with her eyes slightly wide, the expression of someone encountering something they didn't know they'd been missing. On my last day at the station, I visited Wen Station alone. The corridor had been cleaned up, debris removed, the worst of the structural damage patched, the barricade positions marked with small official markers indicating the defensive line. The lighting panels had been replaced, and the corridor was no longer amber but bright, ordinary, the kind of light that makes you think of routine and normalcy. At the far end, near the tunnel access point where Tobias had made his calculation, someone had placed something. A small item, I couldn't tell what from the far end. I walked the length of the corridor and looked at it up close. It was a coffee cup, sealed against the station's atmospheric conditions. A real one, not disposable, a small, dented metal cup that had clearly been someone's personal property. It had been secured to the deck plating with a small adhesive pad so it wouldn't slide. And next to it, written on the wall in standard conclave text, simple block letters recent, were 2 words. He held. That's all, no name, no date, no further inscription. Whoever had written it, and I have my strong suspicions, though I never confirmed it, had decided that 2 words were sufficient. I stood there for a while. The atmospheric processors were doing their wheezing thing, still not fixed, probably not going to be fixed until the next maintenance cycle came around. The sound of the station breathing. The sound of something old still running, still functioning, still here despite the math. I turned on my recorder one last time, and I stood in the corridor and I said, for the record, Kareth Station, Day 22 post-engagement. I'm standing in Wen Station. The corridor held. 38 humans arrived at 340 on a ship that nobody was tracking into a posting that nobody wanted for a war that wasn't theirs. One of them didn't go home. The rest of them gave the station something it keeps. I don't know what to call what I saw here in the technical sense. There will be after-action reports and strategic analyses and papers in military journals and all of that. What I can tell you is what I witnessed, which is this. A species that has survived everything its own history has thrown at it came out to the Pale Margin, and it showed the rest of us what survival looks like when you choose it. Not because you have to, because you won't be the version of yourself that didn't. I clicked off the recorder. I walked back through the station. I filed my dispatch. Epilogue: what I carry. I've told this story in pieces over 12 years. In print, in broadcasts, in the deposition I gave to the Conclave Historical Commission, in the quiet of conversations with people who ask me what the war was really like. I tell it differently every time because every time I tell it I've had more distance from it, and distance does strange things to memory. It softens some edges and sharpens others. The sharpened ones are always the small things, the sound of the boots in the docking bay, the coffee in the quiet outside the quarters, the 2 words on the wall. Morrow left the Conclave exchange program after the war, and I lost track of him for a few years. I found out eventually that he'd gone back to Earth and then, after some time, re-enlisted in a different capacity, some kind of advisory role in what I understand to be an expanding program of human military presence in Conclave-adjacent space. I wasn't surprised. He'd told me what he was afraid of. He'd also told me what he was more afraid of. Reyes wrote a monograph on adaptive defensive architecture that became a standard text in at least 2 of the Conclave's military academies. I read it. It reads exactly like her, precise, practical, and occasionally in the footnotes, quietly funny. Usrulvok retired from active service 4 years after Kareth and took a teaching position at the Drenathi Strategic Institute. He teaches a course on human military engagement. I know because I was asked to contribute a recorded testimony to his curriculum, and I spent 3 hours talking into a camera about that week on Kareth Station. And at the end of it, I cried a little, which is not something I usually admit, but the record should be complete. Adiz Okonkwo's arm healed fully. She was promoted twice in the 2 years following Kareth. I've met her once since at a commemorative event, and she remembered me immediately and asked if I'd been back to the station. I told her I hadn't. She said I should go. She said they fixed the lighting in Wen Station, made it a proper memorial, and added names. Tobias Wen's name is on a plaque now, alongside Usrulvok's official notation and the battle record. She said, but someone put the coffee cup back after the plaque went up. I said, was it you? She gave me a look. She said, no. It was there when the crew showed up to install the plaque. Nobody knows who. She smiled when she said it. The kind of smile that means, I have a theory, but it's better as a mystery. Tobias Wen, 23 years old, Singapore, 14 months in the unit. There's a plaque now, and a cup, and a corridor that held. The 8th Hammer was disbanded 18 months after Kareth. The official reason cited in the coalition's records was strategic restructuring. Vethcrossel retired. 14 for 14 and 1 that got away, and the 1 that got away made 14 feel like nothing. The pale margin is, as of this writing, quiet. The shipping lanes run. The independent systems that had signed economic cooperation agreements with the Conclave are still independent. The station is still there. Atmospheric processors still wheezing, gravity plating on Deck 7 still running at 0.91 standard, because nobody has prioritized getting the replacement parts out to the pale margin. Some things chain. Some things are stubbornly, comfortingly the same. I've been asked, over 12 years, for my definitive assessment of what the humans brought to Kareth Station. What quality, what difference, what element that hadn't been present in the Conclave's previous engagements with the 8th Hammer. I used to give a complicated answer involving tactical doctrine and adaptive problem-solving and cross-species integration capabilities. All of that is true, all of that is documented. But the real answer is simpler. They'd been afraid before, they came anyway. They'd been told the math was impossible, they did the math themselves. They lost one of their own in a tunnel that needed holding. They named the tunnel and they held the line and they put a cup of coffee on the deck and they wrote 2 words on the wall. Not because the outcome was guaranteed. Because the alternative was not something they could live with. I've thought about that a lot in 12 years. I've thought about what it means to build a species, across millennia of brutal history and ungentle conditions, into something that approaches the impossible not with certainty, but with the specific, stubborn, costly willingness to try. I've thought about what that costs them. I've thought about Tobias Wen and what he knew in the 6 minutes he had and what he chose. I don't have the final word on humanity. Nobody does, probably. They're still figuring themselves out, which is maybe the most human thing about them. What I have is the record. The corridor held.